So that then leads to this question of, well, okay, how are they doing this, right? And you've spoken a lot about this already in terms of the Constitution, right? I think there's really two questions to ask, which is like, is this legal?
Mhm.
Uh, and how are they pulling it off in kind of the court of public opinion?
Yeah.
Uh, so do you have a sense of which one of those two angles we should tackle first?
Well, I'll just say, uh, and we're seeing this already play out in the courts. So I'm not a lawyer. I'm certainly not a constitutional lawyer, and so I think the courts have kind of had a mixed approach to how they deal with these things. Right? Some of the court orders have halted firings, or they've halted the funding freezes to these agencies because this is kind of a legal gray area, right? It's does the president have the ability to outright eliminate an agency? No, we know that that's kind of fundamentally unconstitutional. The question is, how much can the president or the president's appointed special federal employee, Elon Musk and team, do to that agency? That's kind of where people aren't quite sure because no one's really tested this before.
Hmm.
Um, but some court orders have come back and said, no, this is not these firings are not legal, right? These firings are not constitutional. And what seems to be happening so far is kind of a muted response from Trump and the team. Funding has not necessarily been turned back on in some of these cases, which leads to the question of whether that's intentional or that's just like a slow reaction. Um, but JD Vance has been quite outspoken about what he thinks Trump should do when these court orders come up against the executive orders or the firings of these things. Right? He he's got this tweet, and he's got some quotes going all the way back to 2021, where basically saying, you know, if the courts stop you, if the courts stop what Trump or Musk or DOGE is trying to do, you should simply ignore the court orders, right? And people have asked, like, is that legitimate or not? This is the tweet he had recently, right? If a judge tries to tell a general how to conduct military operations, it would be illegal. Um, if a judge tries to command the attorney general how to use her discretion as a prosecutor, it's also illegal. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive legitimate power. I think what JD Vance is implying here, right, is that the executive has the constitutional power to do these things. And, if the judiciary says no, they don't, the judiciary is the kind of the final say on what's constitutional and what's not constitutional. But what Vance is implying with this kind of tweet, or with his apocryphal quoting of Andrew Jackson, that Trump should simply ignore the court rulings and dare the court to enforce them. He's implying that the executive branch doesn't have to listen to the judicial branch anymore, and that's very dangerous. Going back to our kind of whole stint about you know balances between the three branches of government, right? I don't know,
Well, and it
Josh.
and it and it raises this kind of the murkiness of this question of like constitutional crises.
Yeah,
No one really like, are we in a constitutional crisis? Like the
right.
question is, could we devolve into being in one, or
Are
maybe
we
we're
already
already
in
in
one?
one?
Yeah,
And that kind of stems from the fact that like when things go through the courts and the legal proceedings are long and they're drawn out, they take years sometimes to resolve, and there's appeal after appeal. So it's like, well, kind of the answer to that question would result in kind of the final say of the final court, and then like whether or not the executive branch listens to that court.
right.
Because there is really no way to enforce the judicial rulings if the person being told to listen is the executive branch itself,
Right. Well, and
which
this
would
is
be the enforcer in
yeah,
that
and this has
scenario.
happened before, right? So Vance quotes Andrew Jackson, and this may or may not have actually been the quote that Jackson said, but when the Cherokee Nation, right, was being forced towards what will become the Trail of Tears, right? This is the era of Indian removal. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Cherokee sovereignty. This is a famous case, right? It's Georgia versus Worcester, and John Marshall, the chief executive, kind of surprisingly sides with the Cherokee, saying even though they are deemed kind of domestic dependent nations, they do retain a certain level of sovereignty. So the state of Georgia cannot force them out. And Andrew Jackson supposedly said something along the lines of, Justice Marshall has made his decision. Let him now enforce it, right? And JD Vance has basically said Trump should do what Jackson did during Indian removal, right? Dare the courts to enforce it, which they have no power to do, because they don't control the military or the police, and so it's really kind of dubious legal ground, right? We've had it happen before,
Mhm.
to the shame of our country and its history, right? That like it's no coincidence that it's Indian removal, kind of one of the black marks on American history, that the executive ignores the judiciary on something, right? And so it's interesting that JD Vance uses that as his like clear cut example of what Trump should do. Uh, it's kind of shockingly historically tone deaf, but that seems to be the intention if we get to that stage, right? And of course, these court orders are working their way up through the appeals process right now, so we're going to see just what a constitutional uh, showdown looks like if Trump somehow ignores what the Supreme Court rules.
Mhm. And if we get to that point, we've already heard some of the congressional Democrats say like, well, what do you do? Because they're basically neutered in that point at that point if they
Yeah,
don't have bipartisan backing to, impeach at that point.
that's right.
So it comes
Yeah,
down to the people, right? And they've said, well, it's going to take protests. It's going to come
yeah.
down to the power of the people. And
People in the streets. Yeah,
we've seen kind of the rhetoric coming out of the Trump camp and certainly Elon, whether he's standing behind the Oval Office or just tweeting it. Like they have a mandate from the people. Like they are of the people. They are
right.
doing all of this for the people.
Yeah.
So
That
go ahead.
well, I was just going to say that the mandate language really bothers me, and that's a pet peeve that I've talked about with you elsewhere. But there's no such thing as a mandate of the people just because you win an election. The people are still the people, and the president is not the embodiment of the people. That's a monarchy, right? Like that fundamentally is how monarchy is understood in the pre-modern era. That's not how the presidency is understood, in the United States. So a mandate to rule, a president may have popular support 1 minute and not the next. There is no permanent mandate for rule over a four year period or anything like that. Although that's what Musk and Trump continue to kind of imply in their rhetoric. So obviously there's the legal side of this, but there's also kind of the swaying of public opinion side of this, because not everyone is as freaked out or angry about Doge as you and I, Josh, right? So how have they won people over to the idea that Doge is legitimate so far, right? And maybe even people listening to this think, well, yeah, but Doge is cutting fraud. They're uncovering corruption. So clearly they're doing something good, even if they're not doing it in the proper methods, right? So maybe Johnny's just a stickler for, you know, following the rules, and they like the chainsaw approach. So why is this maybe not all that it seems to be?
Yeah, well, the what you're describing to me sounds like sort of Machiavelli, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, and you could say that for all of Trump. Like, yeah, I've heard he's very immoral. He's not a good person, but he's effective, or
Right.
like,
I hear that. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, Doge might not be completely legal, but it's effective. Like, look at all the waste, look at all the fraud, look at all the
Right.
abuse we've covered. The answer is they're lying.
Yeah. 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 Okay. Tell us about that. Right. Because they keep throwing numbers out there. Right. I mean, we heard it in that Oval Office press conference. We've heard it in some of these other, interviews that Musk has given, that Trump has cited. Even the press secretary holding up the receipts, so to speak, of the corruption. Uh, how are they throwing these numbers around and blatantly maybe deceiving as they do that?
Well, it is blatant and it is deception. I mean, we hear the term misinformation a lot. Like anything related to Doge is not misinformation. It's disinformation. And that's an incredibly important distinction, right? Disinformation is deliberate,
It's
right?
a,
They're
yeah, it's a
doing it on
lie.
purpose.
Yeah,
It's a lie. They're not just misinformed about this stuff. And as historians, I think everyone should be thinking historically about things in society. Trust but verify. If you're reading a news source that you generally trust, like it's fine to trust it, but you got to verify.
yeah,
If you're seeing a tweet from Elon Musk, you should never be trusting that, like ever. But still like verify that it's bullshit, right? Like, and so that's kind of the thing that I want to do now, which is get into just one, because I mean, how could you unpack every single one? That's what they want us to do, and we do have to do that. But for the purposes of like this conversation, I think just picking one is what we have to do and do a deep dive into it. But a lot of this is it kind of imbued with inflammatory rhetoric, right?
yeah,
So just to read out a couple tweets, I think these are all tweets, but quotations from Trump and Musk over the past week or so. Trump says he wants the Department of Education closed, quote, immediately because it's, quote, a big con job, right? Like, no evidence, just like the
yeah.
Department of Education is a con job,
It's just
whatever that.
rhetoric. Yeah, yeah,
Musk saying USAID is a quote unquote criminal organization as he, quote, spent the weekend feeding it to the wood chipper. All right. And now this one from February 11th is pertinent to this tweet that I've had on the screen here for a couple minutes. He says on X, quote, "At this point, I am 100% certain that the magnitude of the fraud in federal entitlements, being Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, and disability, exceeds the combined sum of every private scam you've ever heard by far. It's not even close." End quote. So that's bullshit.
well, especially because they haven't even looked through all of Medicare and Medicaid and disability services yet. So I don't know where he's getting that idea because they haven't even accessed that information, right?
Yeah. And so we've seen them begin to access Social Security, which is what I want to talk about. But I mean, the way I'd frame all of those tweets and quotations is like it's trust me, bro analysis.
Yeah,
He's saying, trust me, bro. The government's fraudulent. You just got to believe me. And
yeah,
and there's this veneer of legitimacy to it because a lot of people, and we've talked about this, a lot of people have this idea that because Elon Musk is so successful, he's the richest man in the world. Clearly, that means he's the smartest man in the world. And Trump, we can kind of concede Trump maybe is a bit of a buffoon here and there. Like he doesn't really know what he's talking about. But now that he's got Elon Musk, the richest and smartest man in the world, as his tech support, well, we should trust him. Elon's gonna figure it out. He's gonna put us on Mars, and he's gonna get our country back on track. Well, again, I mean that's a conversation for a separate podcast, but I call bullshit on that too. Um, it's just not true. And so
yeah,
what I want to do is get into this Social Security um, tweet and this implication that there's all these dead people
yeah.
um, leeching off the federal government or
Right, the 150-year-old that he talked about in the Oval Office or whatever. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. And I will say, even though we're doing a deep dive, I would contend generally that the DOGE has not yet found widespread evidence of fraud, of waste, and of abuse in the federal government. Like
yeah,
we just have to say that. That's what it is. Now, have they identified things that they, from an ideological standpoint, don't agree with? Like, let's say there's funding for some DEI initiative. Um, they might say ideologically, we don't believe in that. Like, we don't
right.
think federal funding should go towards those initiatives. And that's fine. That doesn't make it wasteful or fraudulent or
Right.
abusive.
Right. And that's a lot of what they've been calling fraud has been things like that, right? Like the USAID stuff. They call that fraud. It's actually just they don't like what that money is being spent on, and so they label it fraud, which is different, right? Like fraud has a specific meaning. It implies illegality, right? Um, yeah.
Right. So let's dive into this. And I'm gonna be kind of in part reading from my notes because I don't have the
That's
time
fine.
right here.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna like memorize all these statistics, but the claim here with this tweet and this Excel table of two columns is that there are tens of millions of recipients of Social Security who are dead, with
Right.
roughly 1.3 million over the age of 150. These claims are unsupported, they're repeated by the White House, and they're parroted by right-wing media outlets.
Yeah.
And we've seen this over the past couple weeks. So the Social Security system was written decades ago using COBOL. I believe that's how it's pronounced. That's capital COBOL, which is
Okay.
a coding language that none of the teenagers or the young 20-something-year-old lackeys that Elon has would know much about.
Okay.
Older, experienced programmers are going to understand that. But finding 150-year-olds specifically in the databases is not evidence of fraud, and here's why. In COBOL, dates are referenced to May 20th, 1875, when the world established the International Metric Standard, if a
Huh.
recipient's birth date is missing or incomplete. So if we don't have the full birth date information for any citizen since Social Security started, not just living today, any
Their birth.
citizen,
I see. Yeah.
they're going to be listed as 150 years old.
Yeah.
And this is
Yeah.
especially true for like people in rural areas where like the census wasn't
Birth
able
records, right, are not as full. Or, you know, if they've immigrated, their birth record maybe not on file. Um, that would also be right. I'm
yes,
assuming entered the same way in this old system.
that's right. That's right.
Okay. Okay.
And so you might say, well, Elon's the smartest guy in the world. Surely they could have checked and they would have seen that every person at 150 was born on May 20th, 1875.
Right.
And that seems weird. That seems like a coincidence. What an auspicious date of human history to have all these people born. Like it's just like they're not looking for that, right?
Yeah.
Like this isn't being done in good faith.
Right. Right.
Um, so what about the number of people like who are under 100? So that okay, so COBOL accounts for that 1.3. Well, people have still died since 1875 and are listed, in the 140 bracket and the 130 bracket and the 120 bracket. Like we have
Yeah.
millions of people here who are dead. Now he's saying in this tweet, uh, these are the numbers of people in each age bucket with the death field set to false. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
It's just not true. It's just
Right.
not true. And
Yeah.
and so this gets into the bigger question here, which is that we have no evidence as a citizen of this country who's paying taxes or as a historian who like does ask these questions on a daily basis. We have no evidence from DOGE, whether it's on their website or in this tweet, of how they filtered out this data that he's presenting in these two
Hmm.
columns, right?
Yeah.
Anyone who's ever managed even the most basic of Excel spreadsheets knows that you don't delete data ever in a
Right.
database when it becomes outdated.
Right.
Like when
You
it's
could. So you think that like I just trying to distill this, Josh, for us. Like you think essentially they're showing us the data that's in the system, but they're showing it in bad faith to show how confusing these numbers are, right? And to make it look like there's 6,000 uh 600,000 people or whatever that 6,000 number between the ages of 170 and 179 that are getting social security checks, right? Like that's what they want people to look at this and interpret. But that's not actually what this chart means, right?
not at all. I mean, we fundamentally don't have any idea how the filters have been applied here.
Uh-huh.
And you
Uh-huh.
can query a database in 50 different ways
Right.
to get it to reflect data that you want.
Right.
And maybe you could say, well, it was an honest mistake because they got like a couple of 20-year-olds doing this who, are just they're coders. They're not auditors. They
Right.
don't look at this kind of data. So maybe they're just incompetent. And maybe that's true to a certain extent. And we just have to say, oh, these are a bunch of idiots doing this. But like I really like, come on now. Like it's done in bad faith to present a certain data point that can cover what they're doing, right?
Yeah. Well,
Um,
and it's all meant like the slow drip of these kinds of statistics, I would say it's meant to give an air of transparency when there actually is not a lot of transparency about what these Doge people are doing in all of these different agencies, right?
Mhm.
So Elon standing in front of the camera saying we're being fully transparent is not the same thing as him being fully transparent, right? He's saying that he wants you to see charts like this and think, wow, he's sharing all his numbers, but we don't know the actual calculations, the actual parameters that went into pulling this data. So we can't really know what he's showing us here, right? It's impossible to read this chart actually, right? Because again, like this is basic math, right? Like I'm bad at math, but in high school, your chart has to have proper labels. Like I don't know whether there are 448 people between the ages of 190 and 199, or if that number is, 448,000 people, right? Because the 1.3 that you're talking about in 150 to 159 bracket, that would imply a lot more than what I'm looking at here. Am I following that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like it's
Okay.
just the basic point is like this there's a metric shit ton of missing information here to actually understand what this graphic is
Yeah.
conveying. And you can apply that statement to any of their evidence they presented. I
Yeah.
mean, Pam Bondi gets up there and says, I got the receipts. And it's like, here's the agency and here's a little snippet of not even a full sentence. And you see the the word DEI in there. It's like, oh, that's there it is. Like there's the evidence. It's like, that's not evidence. Like, what
Mm.
are we talking about here? Like, let's actually get granular. And we can go to the DOGE website and look at that. But
Yeah.
that's if we have time to do that. That's equally fraught, just more
Yeah.
nefarious in how it's presented.
Yeah.
So I just want to say real quick, um, in 2023, the Social Security Administration Inspector General concluded that there were a little under 1 million people not included in the death master file within the administration. This is because they
Okay.
were alive after the digitalization of the department. Okay.
Uh-huh.
This is an investigation done by the Inspector General, specifically hired for Social Security, because there's each agency has like their own,
Right.
person who's aware of how it operates and also is there to be a watchdog to make sure there isn't widespread fraud.
Yeah.
Uh, One of those funny things about the federal government, they already had auditors before all this. Imagine that. So, of those million people, 98 people were found to be still receiving benefits. So the Social Security Administration checked on those 98 people and found that 14 of them had passed away.
Wow.
So they updated their records on the other 84 individuals. Okay. So basically, to sum that up, in 2023, the Inspector General
Yeah.
investigated this,
Yeah.
and they found out that of the how many people do we got? 340 million people living in the United States. 14
Yeah.
were dead and receiving Social Security checks.
Yeah.
Right? So there it is. There's your fraud.
Yeah.
14 people. Now
And
let's also be clear. They then remedied that
they
right away.
caught it. Yeah. Yeah.
And they caught it through like the normal auditing procedures of the federal government. But we
Yes.
had 14 people,
Yeah.
right? And so
Yeah.
this graphic is somehow implying there are tens of millions of people fraudulently receiving checks who are dead. 2 years ago, we figured this out. It was 14,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, and again, not to beat a dead horse, but like we have the office of the Inspector General
On purpose. Yeah.
on purpose. We've had it for like almost 50 years. There were some
Yeah.
scandals in the 60s and
Yes.
early 70s. That's why it's established in
Right.
1976.
This is a bureaucracy that is established again, right? A bureaucracy that is established to address an actual problem as the system's supposed to work. Those bureaucrats then police that problem for the next 50 years, right, Josh? I mean,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
then just to not to put too fine a point on it, but some of those inspector generals are now the ones that Trump has fired since reclaiming
17.
office.
Right.
17 inspector generals. And so the watchdog organizations that were put in place to prevent fraud are being gutted. And instead, Elon Musk and his small team of unvetted coders are the ones being in charge of finding fraud in the databases. Yeah.
Mhm. And
Um,
you can also extrapolate this with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is like the agency there to be a watchdog to make sure consumers aren't getting scammed by banks. And it doesn't cost that much in the grand scheme of things to run that agency. They've caught something like $21 billion in fraud. So what do if we're concerned about fraud and waste and abuse? We axe that agency. It's nonsensical. It's
yeah.
nonsensical. It flies in the face of exactly what it is they're trying to do. So again, we want to talk about every accusation being a confession. Like
Yeah.
you don't axe the CFPB. No
Mm-hmm.
one who has a credit card wants the
Once,
CFPB gone.
right, right.
Period. That's just basic.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, and I guess it's worth saying as well, like Trump's not the only president to ever fire a bunch of inspectors general. So Reagan did it.
Yeah.
En masse in a similar capacity. But and I think some other presidents, I know Obama fired a few, but
He did. Yeah.
it's not like it's unprecedented, but still, like, the mental gymnastics you have to play to say, well, we think there's fraud and abuse, so clearly the people who are the watchdogs, they haven't been doing a good enough job, I guess, so therefore they're fraudulent and they're probably in on it. So let's
Yeah.
fire them and
Yeah.
actually get rid of the watchdogs and then have a bunch of coders who have no forensic auditing experience whatsoever and also don't know how these agencies work go in
Right.
and do the work for them.
Right. Yeah. Good. I know we're going a long time talking today, and that's okay. I want to quickly just I have not spent as much time looking at the actual Doge site, but you have, Josh. So do you mind sharing that with us for a minute before we talk about the actual why of all this as kind of our wrap up for today? Like, why are they doing this? But before we get there, I'd encourage anyone who's listening to this video to play around on this doge.gov site, which is where they, again, are trying to kind of give us this veneer of legitimacy, this veneer of transparency. Um, as you can see, most of it is just a live X feed. No conflict of interest there. Uh, but show us what they've got up on their website
Well,
and why it again is just a smokescreen in a way.
yeah, and I think let's look at the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Okay.
So a couple things. We've talked a little bit about regulations. So you click on, they got these tabs up here. You click on regulations.
Yeah.
Again, we can agree to disagree on the importance of regulations, and the extent to which they're needed, and the extent to which they slow down a functioning government, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a legitimate conversation to have. So you're on an official government, well, we say an official website of the United States government here, right at the top.
Yeah.
You'd think that needs
You
to be
have
bipartisan, right? So let's go ahead and just label regulations under that tab as unconstitutionality index. Uh, whatever that means. This is the number of agency rules created by unelected bureaucrats for each law passed by Congress in 2024. Um, so you scroll down, and here we've got these really nicely coded charts on total words and total sections of regulation. And then you get a nice breakdown by department or by agency.
so this is implying that what, like the number of words is bad, like more words equals bad? Is that the
Well, it's implying
implication?
that all Americans just think regulation equals bad.
Yeah.
And I mean, the Environmental Protection Agency has 12.18 million words in their regulatory documents. And I mean, millions of words is bad, right, Johnny? Is that
I mean, this is the thing, right? So these are this is a classic example of kind of a logical fallacy here, right? Like the more statistics we can flash up to you, the more legitimate we must be, the more we've quote unquote done our homework, right? Um, and that's what Doge is trying to imply here, right? I remember this marketing thing uh, from a environmental studies class I took a long time ago, right? But she put up this label of like a soap that says it's 100% pure means nothing, right? Because what does 100% pure mean? Just
Mhm.
saying how many millions of words are on the regulations doesn't say whether those words are necessary or unnecessary. It implies a value judgment that is not there, right? It's meant to mislead you.
And we've said this before about Trump, but it's equally true of Elon Musk. They're master marketers.
Yeah,
They know how to sell stuff. And again, I was kind of quipping about Elon not really being the smartest guy in the world. Like what he brings to his companies, whether it's Tesla or whether it's SpaceX, who know what they're doing. That doesn't mean he's the one who gets it. He's the one marketing all of that to the public.
that's right.
And
Yeah.
that's what this is, right? So I mean, we got the regulations tab. What were the other ones I wanted to get into? Spend.
I want to
Uh,
know what join says.
yeah,
Oh, interesting. So this is the recruitment page. You want to join Doge.
right. And so theoretically, if you're gonna be finding waste, fraud, and abuse, you need to be an auditor. You need to have some sort of
Right.
background as an auditor. So what do they
A
want?
CPA or something. Yeah.
Software engineers, infosec engineers, and other technology professionals. Okay.
Uh-huh. That's so weird. And this is the application process. So fundamentally change out the qualified career bureaucrats for these recruited tech bureaucrats instead, right? I mean
Yeah.
that's how I read that, but
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
okay.
So we go to spend, agency spending. I think the thing that stood out to me was this little nugget right at the bottom. Federal deficit,
Okay, interesting.
2019, 984 billion, 2024,
Uh-huh.
uh 1830.0 billion, or that's what, okay, that's 1.8 trillion,
Yeah.
which is an 85.9% change from 2019 to 2024. I mean, how does that stand?
So
What
that would imply that the deficit has grown exponentially, right, since 2019.
and who is president in 2019 and who is president in 2024, right?
Donnie
Like
J. Yeah.
Ronnie J and Sleepy Joe. So
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
clearly Democrats, are just out
In
of control.
doubled the I mean this implies right. So it's doubled over the last 5 years.
Right. So I don't know. I mean, let's do some really complicated history here in 2020. I don't know. The number I'm seeing is 3.1 trillion. And yeah, there was a pandemic.
right. But
Um,
that was under Trump's watch. It was all the way up to 3.1 trillion, right?
right.
And so
Right.
it has come down since then.
It has come down significantly since then. It actually came down, I think, to like 1.4 and has since gotten back to 1.8 over the
Yeah.
past year or two. But I mean, and again, like we're not even trying to say like what should the deficit be or like what's the
Right.
value. The point is this is incredibly manipulative data they're putting
Information.
on
Yeah.
this official government website to
To basically imply that the deficit was doubled by Biden when
exactly.
really it was at its highest at the end of Trump's first term, right? And again, that was because of COVID. It was because of all kinds of economic factors that we could say he did or didn't control. But at the end of the day, that's a manipulation of the data once again to imply Trump is for cutting spending, Biden's for overspending, and really that's not actually
Yeah. Well, we've gotten in like the Pam Bondi receipts that she pulls out at the press conferences.
right.
Here's their quote unquote transparent account of Doge's findings and actions, and their very professionally named wall of receipts. I mean, this is all getting back to just like the meme kind of trolling nature of Elon. Like, it's all meant to like, I mean, is this legit? Well, yeah, it is,
right.
and no, it's just we had to put it together very quickly. But also, this is like the ideological work this is doing is real. Let's make no mistake about it.
Yeah.
And this is like, from what I understand from the New York Times article that was breaking this down last night. I mean, this is all brand new stuff that we're learning about in real time as Americans. Um, you have, I think, screenshots of a lot of these hyper specific contracts, as if you know, we should just trust that Elon and company know exactly what they're looking for here. I mean, I know Elon is like the biggest recipient of corporate welfare in the world, so maybe he does know what he's looking at. Um, but I
Yeah.
mean, so that's just a little intro, and again, like we're encouraging people to do exactly what we're doing here.
Yeah.
Just to wrap this up, one of the nice things about the way the federal government is supposed to work is that it is incredibly transparent.
Transparent. Yeah.
Um, so no thanks. Um,
You can go right on the,
couldn't
yeah.
we just go find out exactly with the click of a few buttons that 89,106 people who are over the age of 99 received a Social Security check in December of 2024? Imagine if it was so simple that we could just do that in under a minute. And
We
well, the
just did.
point,
Yeah.
I apologize for my sarcasm, but the point is you can.
Yeah. Right. There's already transparency in all these systems. And so they're inventing a problem that is not there to justify their insertion into all of these different agencies. Which brings us then, Josh, to this last point. And hopefully the wall of receipts and that wall of numbers hasn't thrown off all the humanities thinking people in the room like me, who don't crunch numbers all day. But why are they doing it then, right? So if all of this is a big smokescreen, if Elon is justifying Doge with made up statistics and manipulated numbers, um, why are they doing it? Is it just to kind of have fun, to mess with us, to troll us, which is not necessarily uncharacteristic of Trump or Elon Musk, and their public personas. But why are they doing it?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. Like, that's the million-dollar question. I think there's a couple different answers. Uh, One is to insulate themselves from investigation and regulation. I mean, this is
Yep.
not a new graphic. This is from February 11th. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, that seems like 2 months ago, the way things are going. But um, there are so many ongoing investigations into kind of worker employee malpractice in Elon Musk's companies.
Right.
Um, you know, there were 24 by the National Labor Relations Board, 24 investigations into Musk's various corporations for violating workers' rights. So Trump fires three top officials at that agency, effectively stalling the board's ability to continue those investigations. The rule on those cases then is now stalled out.
Right.
You just sent me this morning something on the traffic,
Yeah. There. So the what's it called? The
traffic safety.
traffic safety agency, right, which is in the middle of investigating Elon Musk's Tesla self driving cars, right, and the fact that they have caused accidents in the places they've been tested out in California. Those investigations have now been stalled because Doge, right, who Elon Musk is running, has fired the officials investigating those accidents, right? So again, there is kind of a obvious um, conflict of interest here, right? I think that's almost is insulting to just even state that because it's so clear.
Yeah.
But that seems to be part of the motivation. I also think the motivation is in a sinister way to kind of justify the ongoing um, gutting of federal agencies that Trump seems to be committed to here, right? You can't just gut agencies without showing that there's fraud in these agencies, and so therefore you can justify that by coming up with numbers like this. Supposedly, right, the way they got these fiscal conservatives on board is to say that they were going to cut the deficit by doing this.
Right. Exactly. I mean, that's one of the core tenets of what it means to be a Republican, right? You want a fiscally responsible government.
Right.
And so the idea is that, oh, we found all this waste. Let's reduce the deficit and have a more streamlined and small, right, government.
Cut the
Um,
fat, cut the pork. Exactly.
exactly.
Right.
And so
Uh,
like wouldn't it just be weird though if a couple days ago the House Republican budget came out um, with like 4.5 trillion in tax cuts.
Yes.
Wouldn't that be weird? Because that would then imply they're trying to cover ground. They're trying to make up ground from incredibly important and much needed agencies that have real hardworking Americans, many of whom are veterans, running them. They're trying to
Yeah.
get rid of all that quote unquote fat to make room for $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, 83% of which benefit the top 0.1%.
Right. So tax cuts not for the middle class as was promised during the campaigning, right? But tax cuts for the wealthy and ultra wealthy.
Yeah.
Um, which is again probably a topic for another day. But the other thing that I've seen kicked around now, they're talking about these DOGE checks, right? $5,000 that they're going to send out to all the Americans because we've saved that much on cutting all this government fraud and spending. First of all, that's not going to help the fiscal budget at all, right? If you just saved money because you think that we are overspending, you don't go then send that money out to the people. I would also say that if they do send those payments out, it's clearly a bribery tactic, right? I mean, that's what it reads to me.
It does. And also, I'm not an economist, but uh, my basic rudimentary understanding of how inflation works leads me to believe that giving every American or every American family, whatever it is, $5,000 to spend, ain't gonna help inflation all that
Right.
much, if that's
Yeah,
something you're concerned about.
it goes back to those same COVID checks that did help spur inflation at the end of the COVID pandemic, right? That again, Trump signed those checks too. It's an old tactic that if we send a little bit of money out, this gets people to be quiet and maybe think that Doge is doing something good. So if you want to sell your if you want to sell your support for $5,000, go for it.
And
Yeah,
so, I mean, this ultimately, I think, just comes back to, again, this kind of notion I've floated now, where every accusation coming out of this administration is really a confession. I mean, Elon, since 2008, has received 20 billion, nearly 20 billion in federal funds for SpaceX, and
yeah,
tack on another 42 million for Tesla for supplying buildings with Tesla vehicles. Um, the accusation is that federal workers, who we know federal workers make less than their private sector counterparts, but somehow the accusation is that federal workers are somehow leeching off the system and
yeah,
getting rich off of taxpayers' dime.
yeah.
This is coming from the world's richest man,
Right.
someone who's receiving billions of dollars in federal subsidies and contracts. We don't even need the armored Cybertruck thing. That's don't even need to go there. It's
Yeah,
already in the tens of billions of dollars he's getting. And like great. I mean, the guy is like doing great stuff with satellites. I'm not saying he shouldn't be getting those contracts. I'm saying it's quite ironic, right? That it's literally him, the world's
yeah,
richest man, saying
yeah.
that the average civil servant is somehow
Somehow the leech in the system. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, good. Hopefully, I mean, Doge continues to distract and amaze and overwhelm, and I think that's again back to what you started us off with here today, Josh. That idea of the muzzle barrage, the muzzle velocity. It's meant to overwhelm us, and hopefully, I don't know. Talking about this helps explain it a little bit more for you and me and anyone who tunes into this. But we're going to be trying to get better at this as we go. We'll see how things play out. There's going to be plenty more to talk about, I'm sure. I was joking with Josh before we started the recording that it feels like we should be doing multiple episodes a week just to keep up with everything, but we frankly don't have the bandwidth for that. Um, or the capacity and so next time though we do have a plan for what we're going to be talking about next, and as things on the world stage have played out over the last few days, this seems quite pressing. We're going to talk about foreign policy and Trump's approach to this new world order that seems to align itself with Russians and autocrats over Western Europe and democracy.
Canadians.
What's that? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Who would have thought that I'd be cheering for the Canadians in the hockey game the other day? But here we are. So That's what we'll be talking about next time, right? Trump's view of the world order and our scary new foreign policy approach. Um, Turns out dictators can be found anywhere but where you'd expect them. And I guess that's kind of where we'll wrap up today, Josh. Right?
Yeah.
Any final thoughts or words?
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you if you're still listening. I mean, we've as we made clear in the first episode, we were shooting from the hip, and we tried to kind of prepare to have some specific, concrete stuff to talk about this time, and we're finding out in real time how to balance that with like what a normal podcast length should be. So we appreciate the growing. If you're coming along and sticking with us through the growing pains, we appreciate it. We want to you know, do our due diligence and also make this something that's, people enjoy listening to and get something out of.
Yeah.
So thank you for listening. Thank you for reaching out if you have, in whatever capacity to tell us that you're listening and you enjoy it. Um,
And please
I
do
think,
keep reaching out, yeah, and sharing this with people who you think might want to listen to it. So,
and if you have questions or you're like, hey, you guys need to talk about this, like let us know. Like that's we're trying to have conversations.
yeah,
That's what we need to be doing.
even if you disagree with us or you think what we said is incorrect, tell us, right? Like we're
Yeah.
trying to foster that conversation that seems to have broken down.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay. Good stuff, Josh. Good stuff, anyone who's tuned in, and we'll see you next time.